Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be cracking open a really fascinating document,
Oh, yeah.
almost 2,000 years old. A letter from the Apostle Paul to his younger colleague, Timothy.
Okay.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at chapter 5 of 1 Timothy.
Right.
And trust me, this isn't your typical Sunday school stuff.
Mm-hmm.
This is a raw, unfiltered peek
Right.
into the very real challenges of building a new community in the Roman world.
What's so compelling about this letter? It goes beyond just theology. It
Yeah.
really reveals how the early Christians wrestled with everyday issues like
Right.
how to support each other,
Yeah.
how to organize themselves,
Right.
and basically just navigate life in a society that didn't always understand or accept them.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Right off the bat, Paul dives into the topic of widows
Right.
and how the early church should care for them. But he makes a distinction, right?
Exactly.
There are certain criteria for who qualifies for support.
He differentiates between what he calls real widows, who are deserving of the church's help, and then younger widows who are encouraged to remarry.
Interesting.
And the criteria for those real widows are pretty specific.
Okay.
Over 60, known for good deeds, raising children, showing hospitality.
Wow.
It's not just about being a widow.
Right.
It's about a certain lifestyle and contribution to the community.
So what do these specific criteria tell us about the values and priorities of the early Christian community?
Well, you notice it's not just about financial need.
Right.
They seem to prioritize good deeds, hospitality, and raising children.
Uh-huh.
It suggests that a worthy widow wasn't just defined by her need,
Okay.
but also by her contributions to the community. Remember, this was a young fledgling community, likely with limited resources.
Right.
They had to be careful about how they allocated those resources.
Of course.
And they clearly valued members who actively contributed to the common good.
So it sounds like they were trying to strike a balance between compassion and responsible resource management.
Precisely. And this tension between providing support and preventing dependency
Mm-hmm.
is one that continues to be debated today, right?
Yeah.
Think about modern welfare programs.
Right.
And the discussions around eligibility requirement.
Right.
This ancient text shows us that these dilemmas are not new.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Paul mentions that widows who remarry are considered to have broken a prior pledge.
Oh, wow.
What was this pledge all about?
That's a fascinating detail
Yeah.
that scholars still debate.
Yeah.
Some suggest it refers to a vow of piety or service to God
Okay.
taken upon widowhood.
Oh.
It's possible that in exchange for lifelong support from the church, these widows dedicated themselves to a life of prayer and good works.
Oh.
Remarriage would then be seen as breaking that commitment.
So that adds a whole new dimension to this idea of widowhood. It's
Wow.
not just about losing a husband. It's about potentially taking on a new, almost sacred role within the community.
Exactly.
It also raises questions about the societal pressures women faced at the time. Were they truly free to choose this path?
Right.
Or were there implicit expectations and limitations placed upon them? These are questions worth pondering.
Definitely.
It's a reminder that while this letter offers a glimpse into the past, it also sparks questions that are still relevant today.
For sure.
We talked about real widows, but what about widows with family?
Yeah.
Where do they fit into this system of support?
Paul is very clear about this. The primary responsibility for caring for widows with children or grandchildren falls on the family.
Okay.
The church steps in only as a last resort.
Got it.
Family duty takes precedence.
This makes me think about the ongoing debates we have today about the role of family versus social safety nets.
Right.
Who is ultimately responsible for caring for the vulnerable? Where do individual obligations end and communal responsibilities begin?
Those are questions that societies have wrestled with for centuries.
Yeah.
And this passage from 1 Timothy shows us that the tension between family duty and societal support is not new. It's woven into the fabric of human community, regardless of time or place.
Speaking of community, let's shift gears and talk about another group that Paul addresses in this letter.
Right.
The leaders, specifically the elders.
Okay.
He lays out some pretty specific qualifications for these folks.
Yes, he does. And it's not just about age,
Right.
although being older was certainly a prerequisite.
Of course.
Elders had to be men of good reputation, capable teachers, and able to manage their households well. Essentially, they were the moral and spiritual pillars of the community.
And these elders, especially those who preached and taught, were to be given double honor.
Right.
What exactly does that mean in practice? It sounds pretty vague.
It's likely referring to both respect and material support.
Okay.
The early church recognized that those who dedicated themselves to spiritual leadership, needed to be cared for both in terms of their reputation and their livelihood. It's an acknowledgement that teaching and preaching are real work that deserves to be recognized and compensated.
It's interesting to see this emphasis on valuing and supporting those who provide spiritual guidance.
Right.
And it ties into that earlier theme we discussed about valuing contributions to the community, right?
Absolutely. Whether it's a widow who shows hospitality or an elder who teaches the faith, the early church clearly prioritized those who actively built up and strengthened the community.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that healthy communities thrive when they recognize and appreciate the contributions of their members, whatever those contributions may be.
No, we can't talk about leadership without talking about accountability.
Right.
And Paul doesn't shy away from that either. He's got some pretty strong words about accusations against elders.
Yes, he emphasizes the need for multiple witnesses in such cases,
Okay.
which suggests a concern for fairness and due process. Remember, this was a time when Christians were often misunderstood and sometimes persecuted.
Right.
Protecting the reputation of their leaders was crucial. And this rule about witnesses served as a safeguard against slander and false accusations.
It's like an early version of a legal system.
Yeah.
Trying to ensure that judgments are based on evidence and not just hearsay.
Right.
It shows a desire for order and justice within the community.
It's also a reminder that leadership, even spiritual leadership, is not above scrutiny.
Right.
Paul is acknowledging that even those in positions of authority can make mistakes.
Yeah.
And that there need to be mechanisms in place to address those mistakes fairly.
Okay, I have to ask about this line about not muzzling oxen while they thresh grain.
Oh, yeah.
It seems so random. What does that have to do with church leadership?
That's a classic example of Paul using a proverb to make a point.
Okay.
It's actually a quote from the Old Testament.
Got it.
And here he's using it to argue for fair compensation for those who labor in the church.
Interesting.
If even an ox deserves to eat while it's working,
Mm-hmm.
surely those who are spiritually nourishing the community deserve to be supported, right?
So it's not about animal rights, it's about workers' rights.
Right.
That's a pretty clever way to make the case.
It's a powerful analogy that transcends time and culture.
Yeah.
The idea that those who labor deserve to be compensated fairly is still very much relevant today.
Right.
Think about minimum wage debates or the push for fair pay in various industries.
Of course.
It's fascinating to see this principle rooted in such an ancient text.
It's making me think about all the different ways we labor in the modern world.
Yeah.
And how those labors are valued or sometimes undervalued. It's a reminder to consider not just the work itself, but also the people behind the work and whether they are being treated justly.
That's such a great point. This seemingly simple proverb about oxen and grain opens up a whole conversation about labor value and justice.
Right.
And it shows us that these conversations have been happening for centuries, which I think is both encouraging and challenging.
It is encouraging because it means we're not alone in grappling with these issues, but challenging because it means we still have work to do to create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. And perhaps this ancient wisdom can guide us as we continue to strive for a better future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part, from the complexities of widow care to the qualifications of elders, and even a bit of ancient labor law. But there's still much more to uncover in this fascinating letter.
Yeah, definitely. Join us for part 2, where we'll continue to explore Paul's advice to Timothy and discover even more timeless wisdom hidden within this ancient text.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 1 Timothy chapter 5.
Oh, yeah.
We're really starting to see how this letter, while written centuries ago, grapples with issues that are still relevant today.
Absolutely.
From social support systems to the challenges of leadership.
It's remarkable how these themes transcend time and culture, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Human nature, with all its complexities and contradictions, seems to remain remarkably consistent throughout history.
Absolutely. So what else did Paul want to emphasize to Timothy as he navigated the complexities of leading this young community?
Well, one passage that stands out is Paul's reflection on the nature of sin and accountability.
Okay.
He talks about how some sins are evident, preceding a person to judgment, while others follow after.
That sounds a bit cryptic. What do you make of that?
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests that some sins are so blatant, so public, that the consequences are immediate and unavoidable. But there are other sins, perhaps more hidden or subtle, that might not catch up with a person right away.
It's almost like there's a cosmic scorecard being kept.
Yeah.
And some entries are tallied immediately while others are marked for later review.
Precisely. And this applies to good deeds as well.
Oh, okay.
Some are instantly recognized and celebrated,
right.
while others might go unnoticed for a time. But Paul seems to be assuring us that even those hidden acts of kindness, those quiet sacrifices, don't go unnoticed in the grand scheme of things.
It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That even the smallest acts of goodness have lasting value even if they aren't immediately recognized. But if we zoom out from the individual level, this passage also seems to be addressing a broader concern for the reputation of the community as a whole, right?
Absolutely. Paul is reminding Timothy that the actions of individuals within the community can reflect on the group as a whole.
Right.
If members are known for their sins, it could damage the credibility and effectiveness of their mission.
Sure.
So there's this delicate balance between individual accountability and collective responsibility that Timothy as a leader needs to navigate carefully.
That reminds me of the challenges that many organizations and communities face today, trying to hold individuals accountable for their actions while also protecting the reputation and integrity of the group.
It's a timeless challenge, and it's interesting to see how the early Christians grappled with it. This passage from 1 Timothy suggests that they were very aware of this delicate balance, recognizing that the actions of one could impact the perception and effectiveness of the many.
It highlights the interconnectedness of community, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're not isolated individuals. Our actions ripple outward and affect those around us for better or for worse.
And that brings us to another piece of advice that Paul gives to Timothy, which emphasizes the importance of fairness and avoiding bias. He tells Timothy to do nothing from partiality.
That seems pretty straightforward, right? Don't play favorites. Treat everyone equally.
On the surface, yes. But if we delve a little deeper, I think it reveals a lot about the potential pitfalls of leadership, especially for someone like Timothy, who is relatively young and inexperienced.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Imagine being in Timothy's position.
Yeah.
He's leading a diverse community, likely with a mix of personalities and backgrounds. It would be easy to fall into the trap of favoring those who are more like him, those who agree with him, or those who are more prominent within the group.
So Paul is giving him a gentle reminder to stay impartial, to resist the temptation to let personal preferences or alliances cloud his judgment.
Exactly. He's urging Timothy to make decisions based on fairness and principle, not on personal connections or biases. It's a powerful reminder that true leadership requires objectivity and even-handedness, a willingness to treat everyone with respect and consideration, regardless of their status or affinity to the leader.
It's like that old saying, justice is blind. But let's be honest, that's a really high standard to live up to, isn't it? We all have our own biases and preferences, even if we're not always aware of them.
Of course. We're all human, and we bring our own experiences and perspectives to the table. But I think the point is to be aware of our biases, to actively work against them, and to strive for fairness in our interactions with others, especially if we're in positions of authority.
It's a lifelong journey of self-awareness and conscious effort, isn't it?
It is, and it's a journey worth taking, because the alternative, allowing our biases to dictate our actions, can lead to injustice, division, and a breakdown of trust within a community.
Speaking of trust and making wise decisions, I'm drawn to the part where Paul warns Timothy about laying hands on anyone hastily. What's the significance of that?
That's a fascinating instruction.
Yeah.
Because it highlights the weightiness of conferring authority or responsibility onto others. Paul is essentially telling Timothy, don't rush into this. Take your time. Observe character carefully. Make sure the people you elevate to positions of leadership are worthy of that trust.
I can see how that would be crucial in building a healthy and sustainable community. Choosing the wrong people for leadership roles can have far-reaching consequences, leading to division, mismanagement, and even abuse of power.
Exactly. Paul understands that leadership is not just a title. It's a weighty responsibility that impacts the well-being of the entire community. And he's urging Timothy to be cautious and discerning in how he bestows that responsibility.
This whole conversation about laying hands is making me think about all the different ways we lay hands on people today, not just in a religious context, but in a metaphorical sense.
Right.
We entrust people with positions of authority in our workplaces. We give them our votes in elections. We follow their lead on social media. We support their businesses with our dollars.
That's such an insightful observation.
Yeah.
You're right. We're constantly making choices about who we empower and who we trust.
Yeah.
And those choices, whether we realize it or not, have ripple effects throughout our communities and the wider world.
It's a powerful reminder that even in our seemingly secular world, the act of laying hands, metaphorically speaking, is not something to be taken lightly. It carries weight, it has consequences, and it shapes the world around us. We need to be just as discerning in our choices as Paul was urging Timothy to be.
Absolutely. Whether we're choosing a mentor, hiring an employee, or even just deciding who to follow on social media, we're making decisions about who we allow to influence our lives and the lives of others. It's a responsibility we shouldn't take lightly.
This is really making me think about my own choices and the criteria I use when deciding who to trust and who to empower. It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to make a positive difference in the world, isn't it?
It is. By being mindful of our choices and considering the character and integrity of those we empower, we can contribute to building stronger, healthier, and more just communities.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into 1 Timothy chapter 5. You know, it's been a fascinating journey so far.
It has.
I have to say, this letter has really taken me by surprise. Who knew that an ancient text could be so relevant to the challenges we face today?
It's a testament to the enduring power of human experience, isn't it?
It is.
Whether we're talking about leadership, community dynamics,
Right.
or even just navigating the complexities of everyday life, it seems like some things never really change.
It's almost like Paul was sitting here with us, offering his wisdom on how to build a better world. Speaking of which, what other insights can we glean from this letter before we wrap up our exploration?
Well, there's this one passage that stands out, almost like a postscript after all the serious instructions about leadership and accountability.
Okay.
And it's about wine.
Oh, yes. The part where Paul advises Timothy to stop drinking only water and have a little wine for his stomach. I'll admit it felt a bit random the first time I read it.
It does seem a bit out of place, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Sandwiched between discussions of weighty matters, like choosing leaders and caring for the vulnerable. But I think that unexpected juxtaposition is precisely what makes it so intriguing.
So what's the deeper message here? Is Paul just dispensing some friendly health advice?
It's certainly possible. Remember, Timothy was apparently prone to stomach ailments.
Right.
And in those days, wine was often considered a safer beverage than water, especially if the water source was questionable.
Right, of course.
But I think there's also a deeper message here, one that speaks to the importance of balance and self-care, even amidst the demands of leadership and ministry.
It's like Paul's reminding Timothy, hey, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
If you're going to effectively lead and serve others, you need to take care of your own well-being.
Exactly.
Both physically and spiritually.
It's a message that resonates deeply with us today, especially in a one that often glorifies busyness and self-sacrifice. We're constantly bombarded with messages that tell us to push harder, do more, and never slow down. It's easy to get caught up in that whirlwind and neglect our own needs.
It's almost like we've turned busyness into a badge of honor, haven't we?
It is.
But this little snippet about wine serves as a gentle reminder that self-care is not a luxury. It's an investment in our ability to show up fully for ourselves and for others.
I love that self-care is an investment. It reframes the whole concept, doesn't it? It's not selfish, it's actually an act of service. Because when we take care of ourselves, we're better equipped to care for others.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into 1 Timothy chapter 5. It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've uncovered so much wisdom in this ancient text wisdom that's surprisingly relevant to the challenges we face in the modern world.
It's a reminder that even though centuries separate us from the world of Paul and Timothy, we're still grappling with many of the same fundamental questions. How do we build strong communities? What makes for effective and ethical leadership? And how do we find balance and wholeness amidst the complexities of life?
Those are questions that each generation must wrestle with. And while the answers may evolve over time, the wisdom contained in this ancient letter offers us valuable guidance as we navigate our own paths. Absolutely. So as we conclude our deep dive, let's leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question, one that builds on the themes we've explored today. If 1 Timothy chapter 5 were written today, who would be the widows of our time? Who are the most vulnerable members of our society, and how can we best ensure their well-being? What qualities should we prioritize in those we entrust with leadership, whether in our communities, our workplaces, or our government?
Such important questions.
These are powerful questions that invite us to reflect on our own values and actions. As we've seen, the wisdom of the past can illuminate the challenges of the present and inspire us to create a more just and compassionate future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.